Charlotte and Caleb in the wasteland. When hope begins to fray. The July sun hung low but merciless over the wide Wyoming sky, beating down on the red trail that stretched like a scar across the open plains. Dust rose in sheets with every step Charlotte Zier took, clinging to her skirts and lining the creases of her weathered face. Her boots cracked near through, at the toes, scraped along the hardened sagebrush. Each step sent a quiet prayer up her spine, though her lips no longer moved with words. They had long since dried and cracked. In the crude cart behind her, a structure barely worthy of the name, more broken crate than wagon, lay her last reason to keep going. Caleb, her son, his ribs pressing sharp against the thin fabric of his shirt, his breath-shallow skin glazed with sweat. She clutched him closer, as if by force of will she could protect him from the sun, the hunger, and the silence that threatened to swallow them both. He stirred against her side, barely audible. "Ma," he whispered, "my belly hurts." The sound broke something inside her. She stopped, crouched down beside him in the dirt, and brushed his damp hair back from his burning forehead. Her hand trembled. "I know, baby," she said, voice ragged. "Just a little farther. We'll find something." But she didn't believe it. She hadn't for days. The land around them offered no comfort, just low hills, rising in the distance, coated in dry grass and silence. No wind, no bird song, no sign of a ranch house or passing wagon. Just the road they had followed from Kansas after the fever took her husband, and the bank took everything else. And now, with only a dying mule, a sick child, and a direction that had become more wish than map, Charlotte's will began to crack. But she kept walking because the only thing more terrifying than moving forward was stopping. The hollow promise, Charlotte's war between love and despair. As the sun dipped lower behind the hills, bleeding streaks of orange across the sky, Charlotte's knees buckled. Not from weakness, not entirely, more from the overwhelming weight of her helplessness. She dropped beside the cart and pulled Caleb into her lap, cradling his limp body close. His fever had climbed with the afternoon, and now his eyes barely opened. She whispered apologies into his hair, soft broken sounds that meant nothing to the wind. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, the words falling from her like leaves in drought. "I didn't know it would be like this. I thought we'd find something. I thought someone would help." She had told herself that for 2 days now, told Caleb they were almost there, that Riverton was just around the next bend. She clung to the name of that town like it was a prayer carved into stone, but the truth was, she didn't even know if it existed. All she had was a second-hand mention from a man in a Kansas depot who said work could be found there. And now, even that hope had frayed at the edges. Her own body ached from days of walking with no food and little water. Her hands were raw from holding the reins too tightly. Her throat burned with thirst, and still she could not cry. There were no tears left to give. Caleb whimpered softly, and Charlotte's heart clenched in panic. She held him tighter, rocking him gently, even as she felt the weight of her failure settle in her chest like iron. She had given everything she had to save him, and now there was nothing left to give, until she saw the shadow move. A rider appears. Holly's McCree in the dying light. Charlotte's head snapped up, her eyes bloodshot and dry-strained against the setting sun. A figure approached on horseback, emerging like a ghost from the haze of light and dust. For a heartbeat, she thought she might be hallucinating. But no, the sound of hooves was real. The mule shifted uneasily beside her. Charlotte stood slowly, one arm still around Caleb. The rider came closer, slow and measured. He was young, maybe mid-20s. His face sun-darkened and calm beneath the brim of his hat. A bedroll and saddlebag were strapped behind him, no signs of rush or fear. Just presence. He stopped a few feet away and looked down at her. His eyes, gray-sharp and unreadable, settled on Caleb first, then returned to hers. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was low, gravel-edged from trail dust. Charlotte forced her mouth to move. "No," she said hoarsely. "Just tired." Caleb coughed a small dry sound that cut through the stillness. The cowboy dismounted. He moved slowly, not out of caution, but consideration, like someone used to not startling wild things. He crouched near them, still keeping a respectful distance, and slid off his pack. From it, he unwrapped a small bundle, a loaf of bread, a wedge of jerky, and a can of beans. The scent hit Charlotte like a blow to the gut. "He needs food," the man said simply. Charlotte's pride bristled. "We don't take charity." "I didn't offer charity," he replied evenly. "I offered a meal." He placed the bundle a foot from them and stepped back. "You choose," he said. "But he doesn't look like he can wait much longer." Then he walked to his horse and waited, arms folded loosely. Charlotte looked at the bread, then at her son. Her hands trembled. Hunger clawed at her resolve. And slowly, one tear escaped down her cheek as she reached for the loaf. The first meal, bred pride and the beginning of trust. Charlotte hesitated for several long moments, her gaze fixed on the bundle of food like it might vanish if she blinked. Pride warred with desperation. She had spent the last stretch of her life holding on to dignity with white-knuckled fists, refusing handouts, standing tall even as everything fell apart around her. But now, looking at her son, pale and sunken-eyed, pride felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. Her fingers closed around the bread. She broke off a small piece and offered it to Caleb. His hands trembled as he reached for it, eyes wide, lips parting, but no words coming. He devoured it like a starving animal, crumbs clinging to his cheeks. Charlotte broke off more, handed it to him, then tore a rough corner for herself. She chewed slowly, almost reverently. The jerky was tough, but it steadied her as she forced it down. She could feel the man's presence behind her, distant but not removed. He hadn't walked away after handing them food. He hadn't lingered close either. He had done something in between, offered without pressing, given without pity. That more than the meal stayed with her. Caleb eventually leaned against her shoulder, drowsy from the sudden fullness. Charlotte turned toward the man. The sky behind him was burnt orange, his silhouette lined with dust and fading light. "Thank you," she said softly. He tipped his hat in response. "Name's Hollis McCree." She swallowed. "Charlotte Zeller. That's my boy Caleb." Hollis nodded once. "You headed somewhere?" Charlotte looked down at their sorry excuse for a cart. "I was hoping for Riverton. Heard there might be work at the rail camp." "That's another 20 miles. You won't make it tonight." "I know." He studied the mule, the cart, and the boy. Then he said, "There's a creek nearby. Good water. Stand of cottonwoods. I can take you there. Help set camp." Charlotte didn't answer right away. She had trusted a man, once loved him, married him, built a life with him. Then the fever came. The bank came, and everything she knew turned to ash. But she looked at Caleb's thin face, his damp curls pressed to her chest, and she knew the decision had already been made. She nodded. Campfire shadows. A night of quiet, mercy, The creek was real. So were the tall cottonwoods rustling in the wind and the cool water that flowed with just enough strength to cleanse the dust from Charlotte's hands. Hollis guided the cart with slow care, letting his horse keep pace with the weary mule. He spoke little, only giving directions when necessary, his voice low and steady. When they reached the grove, he helped lift Caleb from the cart and lay him on a folded blanket in the shade. The boy slept without stirring. Charlotte crouched nearby, brushing a hand over his brow. The fever had not worsened. That at least was a mercy. Hollis built a small fire with practiced ease. He heated the can of beans over the flames, stirring with a sliver of wood. Charlotte sat a few feet away, her knees drawn up, arms around them. She watched him work in silence. She didn't know what to make of him. There was no showiness in his movements, no intent to impress, just presence, steady, unobtrusive, and strangely calming. "You always ride alone?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Most of the time. Worked cattle. Did a few drives down in Texas last year. Headed north now. Might try the Yellowstone Trail." She twisted her fingers in her lap. "You always feed strangers, no? Just hungry kids." That made her pause. She looked at him, then really looked. He was not conventionally handsome. His features were rugged, sun-carved, but there was honesty in his face. A calmness she hadn't seen in a man for a very long time. "You saved us," she whispered. "I didn't do much." "You did enough." The fire cracked between them. Caleb's breathing was soft and even in the dark. Charlotte leaned back against the tree, her body sore but slightly less brittle than it had been just hours ago. Hollis stirred the beans one last time, then stood and gestured toward a spot several yards away. "I'll be over there, if you need anything." She nodded, watched him walk off his footsteps, unhurried, respectful. He lay on his bedroll beneath the open sky arms, folded behind his head. Charlotte looked at Caleb, then back at the man who had offered them warmth and food without asking a thing in return. For the first time in weeks, she slept through the night, mist on the creek. A gentle decision. Morning came softly, the light silver and low mist clinging to the ground like memory. Charlotte knelt at the creek's edge, cupping cold water into her palms and splashing it over her face. The ache behind her eyes had dulled, but not vanished. The lines of weariness etched into her skin remained, but they seemed less cruel in the early light. Caleb still slept curled beneath the blanket with one hand tucked under his chin. Charlotte stood slowly brushing the water from her skirt. She turned to find Hollis crouched beside his saddle, tightening the cinch with practiced hands. His horse blinked slowly in the dawn. "You ride on today?" she asked. He nodded. Was aiming north toward Wind River country, still a ways off. Charlotte folded her arms across her waist. "I wouldn't hold you up." "You didn't." He gave the strap one final tug and rose to full height, brushing dust from his sleeves. Then, almost too casual, he said, "But I was thinking might be better if you and the boy came along, at least as far as Riverton." She studied him, eyes narrowing. "You plan on passing through there anyway?" "No," he said, "but I don't mind the longer road." Her throat tightened. "I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to." "I know," she said, her voice cracking, "but I've had enough of men doing things just to take something later." Hollis didn't flinch. He met her gaze steadily. "That's not what this is." She took a long breath, let it settle inside her. "You'd let a woman and a child ride beside you with nothing to offer." "Not nothing," he said. "You've got grit, and you watch your boy like he's the last good thing on earth. That counts for something. Charlotte didn't speak for a long time. Then finally she nodded once. All right. The slow departure. A trail of dust, a quiet pact. They packed in silence. There was no need for talk. The decision had already been made with her quiet nod and his steady presence. Charlotte gathered what little they had, a thin blanket, a tin plate, the worn-out comb she kept in a pocket, and tucked it all back into the crate cart. Hollis secured the food bundle into one of his saddlebags, cinching it with rough cord. There were no grand gestures, only motions shaped by habit and necessity. When Caleb stirred awake, his eyes blinked against the soft morning light. He looked to Hollis first, then leaned against Charlotte's hip, still pale but stronger than the day before. She ran a hand through his curls, her thumb brushing a spot of dried sweat from his brow. They set off slow. The mule moved without protest, though its pace was sluggish and weary. Hollis kept his horse beside them, never pushing ahead, adjusting his gait to match the mule's trudging steps. Charlotte walked beside the cart most of the way, one hand lightly gripping the side, her eyes scanning the horizon. There was no destination but forward. The trail curved northward through pale grass and low ridges, the land wide and silent save for the sound of hooves and wooden wheels grinding dirt. Hours passed and the sun grew hotter. They did not speak much, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was an agreement, wordless and mutual. I will not press, and I will not abandon. Around midday they passed a burned-out homestead. Only the stone foundation remained with a single chimney still standing like a grave marker to someone's vanished life. The walls were gone. The roof collapsed, the memory of what had been lost too long ago to cry over. Charlotte glanced at it, then away. She didn't ask what had happened there. Hollis didn't explain. Some wounds were better left untouched. Later, as the path narrowed and the cart trailed behind Charlotte, and Hollis walked side by side, it was not romantic. No brush of hands, no stolen looks. Just the rhythmic sound of boots on dirt and the occasional rattle of reins. She finally broke the quiet. "You got folks somewhere?" He paused before answering. "My brother runs cattle outside Abilene. You close used to be. Haven't seen him in 4 years. Why, I never wrote," he said simply. "Didn't figure he'd want to hear from me." She didn't press. He didn't offer more. But something passed between them, then not spoken, only seen. Two people walking beside each other, each carrying the weight of stories that no longer needed to be told out loud. A grove of juniper, where trust settles. Between trees. As the sun dipped behind a line of weather-beaten hills, the trail began to soften into deeper sand and clustered green. Hollis pointed toward a patch ahead, a grove of juniper trees nestled low between the rocks. The land there held a hush to it, the kind of hush that came not from emptiness, but from protection. "Good ground," he said. "We'll camp." Charlotte nodded. Her legs ached from the long day's walk, but it was the ache of use, not helplessness. As they pulled into the grove, Caleb, now more alert, climbed down from the cart, without needing to be lifted. He stumbled a bit, then caught his balance, a look of determination settling across his thin face. "I'll get kindling," he said, voice still soft, but steadier. Charlotte watched him, something loosening in her chest. He was still fragile, but his hands didn't shake as much. He moved with purpose, mimicking the motions he'd seen Holly's use with the fire the night before. She crouched to help build the fire, striking the flint with a bit more confidence than the night before. The spark caught. She blew gently, coaxing the flame alive. Holly's unsaddled his horse nearby, his movements quiet, efficient. Neither of them needed to speak. They worked in tandem like they had done this for years. As they settled around the fire with a bit of the remaining beans and dried fruit, Charlotte turned toward him. "Where'd you learn to ride?" she asked. He smiled faintly, not quite a grin, but something close. "My ma taught me," he said. "Said if a man's gonna live on dirt, he ought to know how to read the horse under him." She sounds like she had sense. She did. Buried my paw herself after a cave-in. Raised 2 boys with a shotgun by the door in a garden that could feed 10. Charlotte exhaled slowly. She had more than sense. He didn't respond, just nodded, eyes fixed on the fire. She smiled faintly, caught off guard by the sound of it. It had been too long since anything made her smile without effort. But in that grove, with Caleb tucked near the fire, and the man across from her, not asking for anything but space to sit, it happened. And she let it happen, a shared stillness. When silence speaks louder than words, night came slowly, as it did on the plains first, with a softening of color, then the rising hush of wind slipping through branches. Caleb drifted to sleep early, curled near the fire fingers, tangled in the hem of Charlotte's shawl. She sat cross-legged beside him, the shawl now wrapped around her shoulders, catching warmth from the flames. Holly's sat nearby, his back against a tree trunk, arms resting loosely on his knees. She watched the firelight flicker against his features. He didn't look like a man who needed to talk. He looked like a man who knew how to wait. She turned to him. "Why are you really doing this?" He didn't answer right away. The fire popped once, sending sparks up into the dark. His voice came low, quiet, almost hesitant. "Maybe because I've looked hungry before. And cold. And I remember the one man who gave me a place to sleep and didn't ask for anything back." She tilted her head. "What happened to him died the next spring. Fever. But I never forgot how he looked at me like I was worth saving." Charlotte lowered her eyes. "I haven't felt worth much in a long time." "You're wrong about that," he said without missing a beat. "You're holding that boy together with nothing but your own hands. That's worth everything." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The wind rustled softly, the fire cracked, and above them the stars thickened into clusters of silver across the black. Holly's didn't move, didn't press. He just sat with her in the silence, offering nothing but presence. And for the first time since her husband's fever took him and the banker raced their home, Charlotte didn't feel like she was standing on the edge of something collapsing. Her body was sore, her heart bruised, but something inside her had steadied. Not healed. Not yet. But steadied. Gray skies. Over Riverton. The first step toward something new. By the time they reached the edge of Riverton, the sky had lowered into a gray veil, as if the clouds themselves had come down to rest on the shoulders of the town. It wasn't much a line of wooden buildings stretched along a wide dirt road, their facades bleached by years of wind. A crooked porch leaned southward in front of the general store. The saloon creaked even in stillness. A single boarding house stood hunched like it had grown weary from watching too many people come and go. Charlotte stepped down from the cart and lifted Caleb beside her, keeping one hand firm on his back. His legs were stronger than they had been days ago, but his thin frame still bore the fragility of hunger and fever not yet fully past. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted the shawl around her arms, and glanced over at Hollis, who was leading his horse to the trough outside the stable. His reins rested loose in his hand, but his eyes remained alert, flicking across the street with quiet intent. "I'll ask after work," Charlotte said, her voice steadier than she expected. Hollis nodded once. "I'll stable the mule. Meet you at the store." She hesitated. "I won't be long. I'll wait." Inside the general store, the air was thick with flour and oiled canvas. The woman behind the counter, middle-aged, sharp-eyed, watched Charlotte with a cool glance, the kind that measured every stranger by their posture and their hunger. Charlotte didn't flinch. She asked about the rail camp, about the foreman, about work. The woman didn't speak, just jerked her head toward the saloon. Back outside, Caleb tugged at her skirt. "I don't like the look of it," he whispered. Charlotte crouched, met his eyes. "You'll stay with Hollis while I speak to the man in charge, all right?" The boy glanced toward the stable where Hollis stood, brushing dust from his horse's coat with slow, even strokes. After a moment, Caleb nodded. Charlotte crossed the street. Her boots scuffed over the boards as she pushed into the saloon where the air was stale with whiskey and sweat. Men hunched over tables or leaned against walls, their faces weathered and silent. A man near the bar wore a vest bearing the railway insignia. His face was lined deep, his eyes narrowed by sun and years. "You looking for work?" he asked. Charlotte nodded. "I can cook, clean, laundry. I read and write. You married now?" He studied her a beat longer than she liked. "Camp needs a cook, $1.25 a week, meals included. Stay on site." "My son stays with me." He shrugged. "Ain't my concern. Long as I get fed. Wagon leaves at sunup." Charlotte left without thanking him. Outside, the sky had darkened. Caleb sat on the stable platform, feet swinging. Hollis beside him, carving a piece of pine, calm as ever. "Got the job," she said. Hollis looked up, knife pausing. "That quick, they're desperate." He stood. "What do you need from me?" "I need to get us to camp. Wagon leaves at dawn. I can't risk Caleb in the cold." "I'll see you there. You've done enough." "I said I'll see you there." She looked at Caleb, then back at the man who had never once asked for anything in return. "All right," she said. "A night in the loft, where stories begin to heal." The stable hand let them stay in the loft above the livery in exchange for cleaning stalls. Charlotte took the pitchfork without complaint, sleeves rolled to her elbows, fingers red from gripping straw. Hollis worked beside her, methodical and silent, the kind of man who did not complain about dirt under his nails. They worked like two people used to doing what needed to be done without waiting for applause. Afterward, as the lantern's light dimmed, Caleb curled up in the hay and fell asleep with his face tucked into his mother's shawl. The loft was quiet, except for the distant clatter of town below and the slow breathing of the mule in the stall. Charlotte sat near the loft window looking out over the rooftops of Riverton. The oil lamp on the street flickered against the wind, casting brief silhouettes on the walls. Hollis leaned against the beam across from her, his face mostly shadowed. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. "Sometimes. What keeps you riding?" He looked at her fully now. "Same thing that keeps you walking." She nodded. Her hands rested in her lap. fingers laced. I used to think I knew where I was going. I thought if I loved hard enough, worked hard enough, that would be enough. It should have been. She paused, eyes still on the window. What about you? You ever let yourself believe in anything I did once? His gaze flicked toward the loft where Caleb slept. Then I saw how fast it can be taken. Charlotte let the quiet stretch between them. I don't want to be afraid anymore, she said finally. He studied her for a long moment. Then don't be. She looked down, then slowly reached for his hand. He didn't hesitate. His fingers closed around hers, not to hold, not to lead, just to be there. They sat that way as the stars faded and the night gave way to dawn. The rail camp, a place to stay. A life to begin. The camp lay 2 miles outside Riverton, tucked into the bend of a shallow river where cottonwoods bent low toward the water. Dust hovered in the morning light as the wagon rattled toward the tents. Charlotte stepped down with Caleb's hand in hers, a small bundle beneath her arm. Her dress clung with sweat and road dust, her boots heavy. She scanned the canvas tents. Cook shed, mess tent, bunkhouse, each one stitched into a rhythm that looked like survival. Hollies had arrived ahead of them. He stood by the tool wagon speaking to a stocky man with a hammer slung low on his belt. When he saw Charlotte, he crossed the yard toward her. "They've got work for me," he said. "Driving supply carts. Nothing long-term, but it keeps me nearby." "You planned that?" she asked. "No," he said. "But I asked." She nodded, small, but not insignificant. Inside the mess tent, a gray-haired woman with a smudged apron handed Charlotte a list of tasks without fanfare: pot washing, biscuit prep, midday stew, and cleanup. No one asked where she came from. No one asked about Caleb. That in itself was a kind of mercy. By midday, her arms ached and her back burned. Caleb sat nearby on a crate, carving a stick with the dull-edged spoon Hollies had given him at breakfast. Charlotte stirred stew at the fire, checking on her son with every turn of the ladle. Later, she stepped outside for air. Hollies leaned against the supply cart, arms crossed, sleeves rolled. Sawdust clung to his trousers. "You settling in?" he asked. "Better than I thought I would." He nodded toward the camp. Rough men, most of them, but they keep to themselves. She looked at him. "You worried for us?" "No," he said. "Just paying attention." And somehow that made all the difference. The wind and the canvas. What we carry and what we let go. The afternoon light stretched long across the campyard, casting shadows from the bunkhouse rafters and the supply cart's wheels. A breeze lifted loose scraps of canvas, snapping them gently against wooden posts, as if reminding everyone that even the wind had a voice. Charlotte stood just outside the cook tent, her hair damp at the temples, apron streaked with flour and sweat. She leaned into the moment of stillness, watching as pine pitch burned near the blacksmith's tent, its thick scent curling into the air. Hollies was there, leaning against the supply cart, his shirt clinging to his back, sleeves rolled high above his elbows. He looked relaxed, but his eyes always. His eyes were sharp, never quite off duty. As she approached, he tilted his chin toward her. "You settling in?" he asked. She nodded. "Better than I thought I would." He glanced across the yard where several men walked past without glancing at either of them. "Rough bunch, most of them," he said. "But they've learned to mind their own." Charlotte followed his gaze, then looked back at him. "You worried for us?" He shook his head. "No, just paying attention." She turned her face toward the breeze, watching it dance across the dirt. "I used to think I had to keep everything locked up," she said quietly. "Like if I let myself feel too much, it would all fall apart." He didn't respond right away. He rarely filled the silence, just to fill it. But now she added, "I wonder if holding it in is what did the damage." He stepped a little closer, not touching her, but standing near enough that his shadow brushed the edge of hers. "I've seen men crack from silence," he said, "and women too. You don't have to carry it alone." Her voice caught. "I don't know how to stop." "You don't have to," he replied. "Just let someone carry part of it." She turned toward him slowly. For the first time in a long while, her eyes weren't guarded. They were just tired and open. The weight in her chest shifted, not gone, but lighter. That night, when she folded the last cloth from the wash line and Caleb curled into his blanket, Charlotte didn't go to the fire. She walked toward the river instead. Beside the river, when the walls start to break, Holly's was crouched at the riverbank, tying a knot in a length of twine, a small carved lure beside him. The dusk light shimmered across the water, turning it silver blue and glassy. Charlotte approached quietly, her steps soft over the sand and stone. "You fish?" she asked. "When I can," he said without looking up. "Helps me think." She sat beside him, folding her legs beneath her. The river whispered beside them, steady and low. For a while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It felt like a place where words would be safe if they chose to appear. "Did you ever want more than this?" she asked finally. He paused, running the cord between his fingers. "I did. Still do." "What kind of more a place?" he said slowly. "A hand in mine that doesn't let go. A life where I don't have to keep riding just to feel like I exist." Charlotte looked down at the water. "I used to want a house with blue shutters. Nothing big, just a porch and maybe a tree out front. Why blue, don't know. Always liked it." They sat a long time after that, watching the moon rise over the cottonwoods. The lure rested between them, untouched. The river moved always forward. Charlotte didn't reach for his hand, not yet, but she shifted closer, just enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. "You think it's too late to want things," she whispered. "No," he said. "I think it's exactly the right time." She looked out at the water again, and for the first time in years, she let herself imagine something more. A second week, where routine becomes belonging. By the second week at camp, a quiet rhythm had settled over them like a quilt stitched in uneven patches. Charlotte rose before dawn, tying her hair back with the same muslin strip each morning. Her hands worked with purpose, kneading dough, washing pots, seasoning stew with a steady pinch. She moved without hesitation, not because life was easy, but because it had become hers again. Caleb woke slowly each day, blinking against the sun's first light, then rising to help where he could. He peeled potatoes, fetched water, and folded linens with small, eager hands. He spoke more now. Soft things, observations about the sky, about the men with hammers, about the scent of biscuits on the fire. The men in the camp kept their distance, but not unkindly. They nodded when they passed her in the yard or tipped their hats when she ladled stew into their tins. There was something in their silence that wasn't disdain. It was respect, as if they recognized the weight Charlotte carried and without saying it, chose not to add to it. One afternoon, while she worked biscuit dough into firm rounds, Hollies entered the cook tent. His shirt was damp at the collar, his cuffs lined with sawdust. He carried a small bundle under his arm wrapped in old cloth. "I traded a man downriver for this," he said, setting the bundle on the table. Charlotte wiped her hands on her apron, unwrapping the cloth. Inside lay 3 books, worn but intact. The top one was a primer, the kind meant for children just learning to read. She looked up, stunned. "Where did you find these wagon full of oddments?" Said he'd hauled them from Illinois, couldn't get anyone to buy paper. "I gave him a day's wages and a rope." Caleb, perched nearby with a tin cup of beans, leaned forward. "Can we keep them? They're yours," Holly said. Charlotte touched the top book like it might vanish. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to." That night, under the lantern's glow, Charlotte read aloud. Caleb leaned into her side, his eyes bright. Holly sat nearby, arms over his knees, listening not just to the story, but to the sound of hope finding its way back into her voice. What the world forgot, grief that walks and the hands that hold. Later that night, after Caleb had fallen asleep with one of the books curled under his arm, Charlotte sat with Holly's just outside the tent. The air had cooled, the camp stilled. The lantern inside flickered gently, casting their shadows long and soft across the dust. Neither spoke for a while. The quiet between them had grown into something almost sacred. No longer the silence of strangers, but the calm of people who had survived things they didn't speak of. "You've given him something I couldn't," Charlotte said softly, her voice almost lost in the night. "You've given him everything that matters." Holly's didn't respond immediately. He looked toward the tent where Caleb slept, then back at her. "When I lost Henry," she continued, "I thought the worst part was the grief. But it wasn't." He waited. It was the way the world just kept going, like it hadn't noticed, like it didn't care. The chickens still needed feeding. The sun still came up, and people kept talking about the weather like I hadn't just lost everything. Her words trembled but didn't break. Holly's didn't speak, didn't nod or frown. He just sat there and stayed. Charlotte exhaled long and hard. "It made me angry, at everything, at God, at myself, at the land." Even she faltered, even at Caleb sometimes, because he kept needing things and I couldn't give them, and then the shame of that. "It nearly broke me." "You didn't break," Holly said. His voice wasn't dramatic or soft, just true. "I came close, but you didn't. You held on." She looked at him, then really looked, and saw a man, not offering comfort because it was expected, but because he knew the weight of holding something fragile too long. Charlotte reached for his hand. This time he didn't wait, his fingers laced with hers, warm and sure. "You make it easier to keep holding," she said. A quiet pact, 2 people leaning toward the same horizon. In the days that followed, a rhythm wove itself between Charlotte and Holly's. Not spoken, not sudden, but steady, like the slow thaw after hard frost. He began setting aside part of his pay with the rail clerk. She, after long hours over the wash basins and cook fires, would bring the books out each evening. Caleb's reading came in starts and stumbles, but Charlotte was patient, and Holly's was present. Always. One morning, as the last of summer's breath curled up from the dirt and the sun took its time, waking the camp foreman approached Holly's near the tool wagon. His vest was unbuttoned and his clipboard sweat-stained. "Work's moving east," the man said. "We need drivers who know terrain." "You're good. You stay, you got a place." Holly's listened, then shook his head. "Appreciate it," he said, "but I've got other plans." That evening, as Charlotte rinsed linens by the river, Hollis came walking barefoot down the bank, his boots slung over one shoulder. She looked up, water lapping at her ankles. "I turned down the job," he said simply. She wrung out a sheet, hung it over a branch. "Why, because I've been thinking about that house you mentioned, the one with the porch and the shutters." Her back straightened slightly. "That was just talk. I wasn't just listening." Charlotte stepped onto the riverbank, skirts damp along the hem. "What do you want, Hollis?" He didn't smile. He just said the truth. To build something that doesn't get left behind. To wake up beside someone who knows how to fight and still chooses gentleness. To be a father to a boy who deserves more than wind and road. The river whispered behind them, but Charlotte was still. "I want you," he said. "Not for a season, not until the trail calls again. I want you for good." She reached for his face. Her hands were rough, calloused, but her touch was tender. "You're asking if I can trust again," she said. "I'm asking if you want to try." And then she kissed him slow, certain and full of everything she had carried, and was ready to finally put down. The wedding, the house, and the long light that stayed. They married that fall in a small clapboard church outside Riverton. The preacher's wife brought a borrowed bouquet of yellowing wildflowers. Caleb stood between them during the vows, dressed in a shirt Hollis had sewn buttons onto himself. His eyes were bright and his grin too big for his face. When the wind came that day, it was soft and warm. When the sun settled over the cottonwoods, it stayed. They bought 10 acres north of the river where the trees grew thick along the bend. Hollis built the house with his own hands, plank by plank, nail by nail. He made the porch wide enough for 3 chairs. He painted the shutters deep blue. Charlotte planted sweet peas beside the steps. She kept a kettle warm on the stove and a tin of sugar hidden in the back corner of the pantry. Caleb started school that spring. Each night he stacked his books neatly by the window before bed. In the evenings, Charlotte read aloud again, only now her voice carried without strain. Mornings were for coffee. Afternoons were for fence-mending, seed sowing, laundry lines, and shared silence. Sometimes Hollis would catch Charlotte watching him from the garden. Other times she would turn and find him already watching her, quiet, steady, full of something deeper than longing. It wasn't the life she had imagined. It was better. And it held. The blue shutters. When the ordinary becomes sacred. The house wasn't large, but it was enough. Enough to hold 3 people who had known too much of loss, and enough to make room for hope without it feeling foolish. The porch wrapped around the front like open arms. The shutters, painted a deep, calming blue, caught the light differently depending on the time of day. Sometimes like storm water, other times like the sky just before dusk. Charlotte swept the steps each morning, not because she had to, but because it meant something to keep them clean. It meant they were home. Inside, the warmth came not just from the wood stove, but from the way voices moved freely through the rooms. Caleb's laughter had returned in pieces, small and careful at first, then louder, easier. Hollis built him a small desk beside the front window and carved his initials into the edge. When Charlotte found it, her fingers hovered over the letters for a long moment before she smiled, soft and private. They all fell into their own roles without having to define them. Charlotte cooked, Hollis repaired. Caleb learned. The rhythm of their days grew as naturally as the roots beneath the cottonwoods, unseen but firm. Evenings were their favorite. After supper, Hollies would sit on the porch with a whittling knife or an open book. Charlotte brought out her mending, and Caleb, once bathed and brushed, curled beside them with questions about stars and cattle trails and words he hadn't read before. Sometimes Charlotte read aloud. Sometimes Hollies did, and sometimes they just listened to the wind. There was no need to explain the sacredness of it. They all felt it, the rare, quiet miracle of peace after long roads and aching grief. The shutters weren't just blue. They were proof that something had been chosen and kept. The season turns. A life measured in small things. By the time spring turned to early summer, the land had begun to answer them back. The seeds Charlotte had sown with quiet care had pushed their way through the soil. Sweet peas climbed the railing. Hollies had built a second stall for a new mule. Caleb had finished his first reader and now sat with the second, sounding out each word with a patience that surprised even him. Life no longer felt like survival. It felt like stewardship. Hollies took a job hauling goods between Riverton and the nearby farms, but he was home most evenings before dark. Charlotte kept the household running with steady hands. She still rose early, still tied her hair back with the same muslin strip, but now her movements were marked by something new. Not weariness, but rhythm. One afternoon, Caleb brought home a splintered tin whistle traded from another boy at school. He showed it to Hollies with pride, and Hollies spent an hour sanding it smooth and plugging a small crack with wax. When Caleb played a crooked warbling tune that evening, Charlotte laughed so suddenly it startled them both. "I forgot what that sounded like," Hollies said softly, eyes on her. "What's your laugh?" She looked at him, her hands resting in her lap, and for the first time she didn't deflect. "I forgot it too." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his calloused palm. She didn't pull away. They didn't talk about the hard days that had come before. They didn't need to. The way Hollies reached for her without hesitation was enough. The way she let him was more than enough. On mornings and meaning, the house that chose them. Once one morning, Charlotte stood at the sink washing the breakfast plates as the light spilled in through the open window. Outside, the cottonwoods rustled like voices too old to name, and the scent of wet earth rose through the breeze. She looked over her shoulder and saw Hollies in the garden teaching Caleb how to drive a small stake into the ground without splitting the wood. Their voices blended with bird song. It was nothing special. It was everything. The floorboards creaked as she turned. The old house, barely a year old, already knew their weight. It knew the rhythm of Caleb's feet, the firm gait of Hollies' boots, the lighter tread of her own. It didn't need to be taught, it remembered. Later that day, she found a note on the table written in Hollies' careful hand. "Ran to town for nails and feed. Will bring back a surprise for supper. Stay put. H." She smiled as she tucked the note into a drawer where she kept others' receipts, old buttons, scraps of fabric she couldn't throw away, because some things didn't need to be useful to be worth keeping. That evening, he returned with salted trout and a bag of early apples. Caleb helped peel them while Charlotte made biscuits. The kitchen filled with the scent of sage butter and baked fish. No feast, just a meal shared, but the light in their eyes, the way they moved around one another, made it feel holy. After supper, they sat on the porch. Caleb played the tin whistle again, the notes still wobbly but joyful. Hollies leaned back in his chair, his arm around Charlotte's shoulders. Her head rested against him easy now, without question. They watched the sun fall behind the cottonwoods in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said. The same eyes. How love becomes the air we breathe. Sometimes, when the afternoon sun slipped through the cottonwoods just right, Charlotte would turn from the garden and catch Hollis watching her. He didn't look away. He never had. His eyes held the same steady gaze she remembered from the first time they met on the trail, that strange twilight between fear and salvation. Only now it wasn't silence born of caution. It was reverence. She stood with dirt on her hands, a basket of fresh onions at her hip, and she'd feel it, that look. Like he was still choosing her every day. Like he never once forgot the woman sitting in the dust, her child burning with fever, too proud to ask for help, but too brave to stop walking. There were days when it was hard. Caleb caught a fever again that second fall, and Charlotte sat through 2 long nights at his bedside, reading the same book over and over to keep herself steady. Hollis stayed up to boiling water, fetching cloths, never once trying to fix what he knew only time could touch. When the fever broke, Charlotte cried, not out of panic, but out of release. And when she did, Hollis didn't speak. He just held her, both of them sitting on the floor beside Caleb's bed, arms wrapped tight, the window cracked to let in the wind. Some loves are built in words. Theirs had been built in weathered hands, worn shoes, and quiet glances. And now, even with no storm in sight, Charlotte still felt it in the way he passed her the kettle each morning, or the way he pressed his hand to the small of her back as she stirred soup. It wasn't the love she had dreamed of when she was young. It was the love that stayed, the weight of stillness. When home becomes a living thing, by the 3rd year the house no longer felt new. The wood had settled, the nails no longer creaked. But it had taken on a life of its own. It breathed when they did. It quieted when they slept. Charlotte often found herself touching the door frame as she passed it, as if grounding herself in something real. The blue shutters had faded just slightly from the sun, but she refused to repaint them. They had seen too much, held too many seasons in their wooden ribs to be made young again. Caleb was growing taller, his limbs lengthening in the way boys do suddenly and all at once. He'd started carving small things with the whittling knife Hollis had given him, animals' hooks, letters. He left them around the house like tokens. One sat on the windowsill, another near the water basin. Charlotte never moved them. The world outside continued its forward churn, rail lines expanding, telegram wires rising. But here in this small bend of Wyoming, dirt time moved more slowly, not lazily, just with meaning. One Sunday afternoon, Charlotte stood in the kitchen with a jar of preserves in her hand and realized she hadn't thought about Kansas in months. Not the farm, not the fever, not even the cold silence of being alone. It was still there inside her, of course, the grief never left, but it no longer led. She walked outside and found Hollis in the field with Caleb showing him how to lash a fence post tighter. He looked up as she approached, his face sun-warmed, patient. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. More than all right. He didn't press for details. He never did. And that was part of the reason she could breathe now. And so it held, not the end, but the continuation of love. They say love is loud, that it burns, roars, or sings. But in this house, between the blue shutters and the cottonwoods, love was quieter than that. It lived in the in-between, in the shared glances before sleep, In the way Charlotte's fingers brushed Caleb's hairline as he read. In the way Holly's boots landed softly on the porch each night, never too late, never too far. They never called it perfect. Perfection had never been the goal. What they had built was something better, something honest. Something that let them be tired and still feel safe. That let them remember and still move forward. On the 5th spring, Caleb brought home a sprouting branch and planted it near the porch beside the sweet peas. "It'll give us shade," he said. Charlotte looked at Holly's, and in his face she saw the man who had handed her bread without asking her name. She thought then not about the farm they lost or the road that nearly took them, but about the day she had looked at a stranger and decided to trust again. That decision, simple and quiet, had rewritten everything. Years would pass. The shutters would peel more. Caleb would grow into a man. The porch would creak louder, but the house would hold. Because it had been made not of lumber and nails, but of promises kept of silence on it and of a love that never asked for anything, except to be allowed to stay.